So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our keynote speaker, Ms. Mitali Nikore, founder of Nikore Associates India, that is described in the literature as a youth-led think tank. And it gives me hope that the next generation is fully capable and eager to take the charge. So with that, Mitali Nikore, please.
Thank you, Margot, for inviting me here. I'm absolutely honored and humbled to be giving the keynote address today at this important gathering where all of us are here to brainstorm gender equality. I know that, having a panel on gender equality dedicated to gender is not a novel experience for, a global summit. But what I'm going to try and do in the next 5 minutes is try to give us some new frameworks to think about the issue of gender inequalities, something that maybe we have not thought through before. The first piece of data that I'd like to use to make this argument is actually a piece of data we're all very familiar with. In the year 2020, when the World Economic Forum came out with its Global Gender Gap Report, it said that it will take 100 years to reach gender equality. But just 1 year later, when it came out with the 2021 report, this number had gone up to 136. So in just 1 year of the pandemic, we had gone from 100 years to gender equality to 136 years to gender equality. And for me, this one number connotes why the time is now to act for gender equality. But it's not only a rights issue. Gender equality is not only an issue of fairness, but it's an issue of missed opportunities. And over the last few years, we have seen this consistently in report after report, that gender equality can actually take us to a point of economic opportunities. One number I'd like to cite is from a McKinsey study, which actually estimates that bringing in women in the same proportion as men into the labor force can actually increase $28 trillion to our global GDP. And of course, this would disproportionately benefit the global South. But these opportunities are not being capitalized. And today, post-COVID, we're at a point in society where women's progress is being threatened. And today, I'd like to lay out 4 specific threats that are actually paramount across the world, threatening women's progress. The first one is around the loss or the lack of economic power. There are several aspects to economic power. The first one is, of course, the disproportionate participation of women in the labor force. When we look at global numbers, the female labor force participation rate stands at about 47% versus 72% for men. In countries like India, we have seen that only 30% of women overall are participating in the workforce. And this number has been low and reducing ever since independence over the last 7 decades. So this is one of the first barriers to women actually acquiring economic power. Even when women are working, they are concentrated in low-paying, low productivity, low growth jobs, which are not in the STEM sector. But it's not only about work, it's also about wealth and inequalities. We know from recent reports by Oxfam that about 100 men own as much wealth as 1 billion women in Latin America. And how are we comfortable with these income inequalities? This is now unacceptable. Even when it comes to asset ownership, women own only about 20% of agricultural land globally, and it's much, much lower in countries in the global South, such as India, such as Pakistan, where women rely on agriculture for their livelihoods, but they don't own those assets. And this automatically places them at a point where they lack the power and agency for their own decision making. And this has only become worse during COVID, where we've seen that overall nearly 64 million women lost jobs in 2020. Now, when we go to the second threat, the second threat is something which terrifies me personally because I've actually spoken to women and seen how they've been affected by that, which is the gender digital divide. And we don't talk about this enough. But the fact remains that even today, only 41% of women globally in the global south have access to mobile phones and the internet. And today we're seeing that the actual progress in the world, in the economy, is being driven by the digital economy, not the physical economy. This transition has only exponentially increased during COVID, and women are being written out of that story. If women are not able to access mobile phones, understand the buttons on a mobile phone, how can they pivot to digital marketplaces? How can they participate in online learning? This gender-based digital divide threatens to take away a lot of progress, even in terms of women's labor force participation. The third factor that I'd like to talk about is gender-based violence. The threat of gender-based violence has always been in our society. Even pre-COVID, 1 in 3 women were actually subject to physical or sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. But the threat today is the fact that we are inured to these statistics. These numbers, the news of women being subject to violence doesn't shock us as a society any longer. And that's the biggest threat. The fact that there was a shadow pandemic accompanying the COVID-19 pandemic was not something that was unexpected to anyone. But our tolerance to this violence, our acceptance of this violence is a threat to women's progress, because we're not taking as strong a stand against it as we should be. And sexual harassment against women on streets, in public places, this deters them from taking up jobs. There are studies which have proven that women would give up job or education opportunities if they have to travel more and risk the threat of violence en route. The fourth factor and the fourth threat that I'd like to talk about today is climate change. And today I'm wearing green because I think it was the color of Women's Day this year, because even this year, UN Women recognized that women stand to disproportionately be impacted by climate change. And this is already happening. If we look at statistics from the UN, 80% of climate refugees that have occurred in the last 3 to 4 years have been women. But the bigger channels of impact are actually coming in on women's time poverty and on women's livelihoods. Women are disproportionately dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. We know for a fact that in countries like India, 70 to 80% of rural women who actually work in the agricultural sector, do labor-intensive work. Noted. So this vicious cycle of vulnerability comes up because of climate change, and also because women have to collect water, and this increases their time poverty if water conservation becomes a challenge. So in the end, I'd just like to end with one quote from Minosh Shafiq, that we need a new social contract fit for the 21st century, where society is no longer sustaining itself on the backs of women's unpaid labor. And we need this now, because I am not willing to wait 136 years for gender equality. Thank you.